Hello, I'm Adam and this is Gosu Coders. Today we're going to talk about, is object-oriented programming dead? Let's get started. I first got introduced into object-oriented programming in 2001, and since then it has been a part of every piece of software that I have ever worked with. And it's a powerful tool. It allows us to break things down into ways that we as humans can understand. I have a cat, I have a tree, for example, but there's been a lot of articles popping up lately on if object-oriented programming is dead, and I wanted to cover that and tell you my thoughts on that. All right, I spent many years in the game industry, and back then I even noticed some of the limitations of object-oriented programming. For example, when I first transitioned to working with the Xbox 360, a lot of the work we needed to do was getting games, getting engines to run in a way that worked on the Xbox 360's multiprocessor. It had multiple cores on it that allowed us to run stuff in parallel. Our system was built in a very fundamental object-oriented way, and it became very challenging to get shared state to actually work. I spent many days and many hours refactoring large parts of that system just so that we could get a little bit of performance increase. Long story short, shared state is incredibly hard with object-oriented programming, as is concurrency as a whole. I think that's one of the reasons why we need to think about object-oriented programming as a possible tool in our toolkit when we go forward, depending on the system that we're building. All right, the second thing that I want to talk about is we've got large amounts of data. Big data is a topic that a lot of people talk about. And object-oriented programming doesn't necessarily feed itself well into working for big data applications. Now it can, but it really doesn't do itself justice. There are many better ways to engineer big data applications. So another argument that object-oriented programming potentially should be something not used for big data applications is that we should switch our mind thinking and start thinking about the data, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing that pretty much every application is doing. It is processing data. And when you have, for an example, a single object and you need 10 million copies of that object, in OOP, for example, that's very inefficient. We start repeating and duplicating lots of data. You can think about that in terms of a database, for example. A database, we are big on normalizing data, not having a lot of duplicate data in there, for example. But in OOP, it becomes inherent because we have 10 million copies of an object, and some data in each one of those objects can be shared across all 10 million copies of those. Again, that's another thing that I've ran into in my career that I think OOP might be best served to not approach. That's my second story, and what I've learned from that most is that there is no correct answer to this problem. Object-oriented programming is incredibly powerful in certain applications, and I don't ever see it going away. And things like Vue.js and Redux have created methods for us to actually manage state in a beautiful way. And I say beautiful because I mean it. It is ways that I never even imagined being possible in 2001 when I first started being introduced to object-oriented programming. But the question was, is object-oriented programming dead? And the answer to that is no, and I don't actually ever see it dying. What I think is happening is that it needs to become a tool that we have in our back pocket that we can pull out and use for the appropriate challenges that we have ahead of us as a software engineer. It is not the answer that we should start with. A lot of systems that I've worked in start with OOP in mind, and that is not the right approach. We should be looking at the data, we should be looking at maintainability, and we should be looking at concurrency and decide which parts of our application are best served for OOP, which parts of our application are best served for a functional approach. And I even like to call another approach a data-centric approach. So there are ways to actually design your application so that data is first. Anyway, that's the answer to the question that I posed today. I do not think it's dead. I do not think it's dying per se. I think it's becoming much more apparent that it doesn't solve everything we as programmers need to solve. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoyed it. If you have thoughts about OOP going into the future, please leave them below. I had a blast, and as always, until next time, keep coding.